Title: The Brabant Killers. Belgium's most terrifying unsolved mystery word count target. Approximately 3,750. Runtime: approximately 25 minutes. Tone: conversational, Kendall Ray style. All names. No diacritics. I need you to picture something for me. It is a Saturday afternoon. You have finished work for the week. You need to pick up a few things for dinner. Nothing complicated, just the usual. Bread, maybe. Some vegetables. Something for the weekend. You grab your coat. You get in the car, and you drive to the supermarket. You have done this 100 times. It is the most ordinary thing in the world. Now I need you to hold that image, because I am going to come back to it. But first, there is a date I need to tell you about. Not the date the killing started, not the date they stopped. A different date entirely. November 2015. Something happened in November 2015 that I have been thinking about since I started researching this case, and I could not figure out how to open this video without telling you that date exists. We are going to get there, I promise. But to understand why November 2015 matters, you need to understand what happened in Belgium between 1982 and 1985. And to understand that, you need to go back to that supermarket, that Saturday afternoon, that coat you grabbed on the way out the door, because for 28 people across Belgium during those 3 years, a trip to the supermarket was the last ordinary thing they ever did. Stay with me. Belgium in the early 1980s. If you have never been, picture a country that does not quite fit any single description. French-speaking in the south, Dutch-speaking in the north. A capital city that hosts the European Union and NATO headquarters and has its own complicated relationship with both. A small country, about the size of Maryland, but dense, industrialized, with a strong middle class and a deep tradition of civic life. Brabant was the central province. Not glamorous, not particularly famous. Farmland and mid-sized towns and commuter suburbs of Brussels. Supermarkets and restaurants and the kind of weekend routines that look the same everywhere. Families doing their shopping, couples going out for dinner, ordinary people living ordinary lives in an ordinary corner of Europe. The people who died in this case were those people. I want to give you some of their names before we go any further, because this story has a tendency, like a lot of true crime stories, to become about the killers, about the mystery of who they were, about the theories and the conspiracy threads and the unanswered questions. And I refuse to let that happen before you know who was actually lost. Françoise B. Continental was 32 years old, a mother, killed in a supermarket while doing her weekly shopping. Jan Waterscoot was a night watchman who happened to be in the wrong place. A child whose name I will not use out of respect for the family, who has never spoken publicly, was killed in a restaurant in 1985 while having dinner with her family. She was small enough that witnesses initially thought she had simply fallen asleep at the table before they understood what had happened. 28 people, across 3 years, across 16 separate attacks. None of them had done anything except be present, be ordinary, be alive in Belgium in the early 1980s. Remember them, because we're going to spend some time now with the people who killed them, and I want you to carry those names with you while we do. The first attacks happened in September 1982. At the time, investigators did not immediately recognize them as connected. Small robberies in the Brabant region. Violent, yes. More violent than a typical robbery, but not yet the scale of what was coming. Local police logged them, investigated them, found nothing, moved on. Here is the first thing you need to understand about how this group operated. They were not impulsive. They were not disorganized. Every attack followed a pattern that only became clear in retrospect. Reconnaissance of the location beforehand. A specific division of roles among the members. A level of tactical coordination that suggested either military training or something close to it. There were 3 of them. Witnesses across multiple attacks described the same 3 figures consistently enough that investigators eventually gave them names. Not their real names, because their real names were never discovered, but descriptive names based on what survivors reported. The giant. Extremely tall, heavy-set, always carried the primary weapon, led the attacks from the front. The killer. The most violent of the 3. Witnesses described someone who shot without hesitation, not in the heat of chaos, but deliberately, calmly, at people who had already complied, who were already on the floor, who posed no threat. If the giant was the leader, the killer was the one who seemed to enjoy it. The old man, older than the others. Sometimes acted as lookout, sometimes as driver. Less visible in witness accounts, but consistently present. 3 people. 16 attacks over 3 years. 28 dead. The attack that first made Belgium truly afraid happened on a Saturday afternoon in November 1983 at a Delhaize supermarket in Aalst. Aalst is a mid-sized town west of Brussels. The Delhaize was a large supermarket, busy on a Saturday afternoon, families doing their weekly shopping. Exactly the image I asked you to hold at the start of this video. The group entered through the main entrance. The giant moved immediately toward the cash registers. The killer went into the aisles. What followed lasted less than 10 minutes. 3 people were killed. Multiple others were wounded. A cashier was shot at close range after she had already complied with every demand that had been made of her. A customer who had moved to shield his wife was shot while crouching behind a display stand. A staff member who had locked himself in a back room survived. He told investigators later that he heard the shots stop, heard footsteps, heard the doors open, and then heard nothing. They were gone. By the time the first police units arrived, the group had vanished into the Saturday afternoon traffic of an ordinary Belgian town. Nobody stopped them. Nobody had seen enough to identify them. The investigation turned up nothing actionable, and they came back. The attack that horrified Belgium most happened in September 1985 in Braine-l'Alleud, a restaurant, not a supermarket. A Friday evening, families having dinner, the kind of dinner that ends a normal week, that feels earned, that you look forward to on a Tuesday when everything is still ahead of you. The group entered the restaurant. What happened next was over in minutes. 3 people were killed, among them a child. I have read the witness accounts from that night. I am not going to describe what they saw in detail. I don't think it serves anyone. What I will tell you is that the witnesses who were present and survived described not just fear, but a specific quality of disbelief. Not the disbelief of surprise. The disbelief of encountering something that your brain keeps insisting cannot be real because it has no category for it. A child. In a restaurant. On a Friday evening. Belgium had been afraid before. After Braine-l'Alleud, Belgium was something else entirely. 2 months later, in November 1985, the group returned to the same Delhaize supermarket in Aalst, where they had attacked in 1983. The same supermarket. 2 years later, 8 people were killed. It was the deadliest single attack of the entire series. And then they stopped. No more attacks, no more sightings, no arrests, no explanation. They simply stopped. 3 people, never identified, walked out of a supermarket in Aalst in November 1985, and disappeared from history. Here is where I need to slow down for a second, because this is the part of the case that investigators kept coming back to, that forensic analysts kept flagging, that nobody could make sense of. The money. Across 16 attacks spanning 3 years, the total amount stolen by the Brabant Killers was estimated at approximately 6.9 million Belgian francs. In today's terms, that is roughly the equivalent of around $200,000. $200,000 for 28 deaths, for 40-plus injuries, for 3 years of coordinated military-grade attacks on civilian targets across an entire province. Now, I want you to sit with that number for a moment. Professional criminal analysts who reviewed this case, not conspiracy theorists, not journalists with an agenda, but forensic accountants and criminologists who study organized crime for a living, consistently flagged this disproportion as significant. The violence was not proportionate to the financial return, not even close. A moderately successful armed robbery crew, operating for 3 years without killing anyone, could have generated far more money with far less risk, which means one of two things. Either the Brabant Killers were extraordinarily incompetent at the one thing they were supposedly doing, which does not square with the tactical coordination they demonstrated across 16 attacks. Or robbery was not the point. If robbery was not the point, then what was? This is the question that the Belgian parliamentary inquiry of 1988 formally asked. And it is the question that opened the door to the part of this story that is hardest to sit with. In the 1970s, Italy, a strategy emerged among certain far-right extremist groups that became known as the strategy of tension. The idea was not to achieve any specific political goal through violence directly. The idea was to create widespread fear, to make ordinary people feel unsafe in ordinary places, and to use that fear to push the population toward accepting authoritarian solutions. More police, more surveillance, less civil liberty, a government with fewer constraints. You create the terror. You benefit from the response to the terror. Belgian parliamentary investigators formally examined whether the Brabant Killers were operating according to a similar logic. Their 1988 inquiry and a follow-up inquiry in 1997 documented several threads that pointed in this direction. The weapons used in the attacks were traced, in multiple instances, to military and police supply chains. Not black market weapons, not stolen civilian firearms. Weapons that had passed through official channels at some point before ending up in the hands of people using them to shoot families in supermarkets. In several attacks, the group demonstrated what investigators described as apparent knowledge of local police patrol schedules. They attacked during gaps in coverage. They exited through routes that happened to be clear of units at the relevant times. This could be coincidence. Investigators noted it was consistent coincidence across multiple incidents. And then there was Marshal Lecu. Lecu was a gendarme, a member of Belgium's military police, who worked in the Brabant region during the period of the attacks. In 1985, the same year the attacks stopped, Lecu died of a gunshot wound. It was officially ruled a suicide. Several investigators who worked the Brabant case over the years have stated, on record in parliamentary testimony, not as speculation but as a documented concern, that they believed Lecu had information about the killers, that his death was connected to the case, that the timing, the same year the attack stopped, the same year the group disappeared, was not coincidental. The official ruling stands: suicide. I am not telling you that the Brabant Killers were a government operation. I am not telling you that Belgian law enforcement organized the murder of 28 civilians. I am telling you what the parliamentary record shows, that investigators with access to the evidence operating under oath raised these questions formally, and that none of them were ever answered. Herman Vervilst, one of the lead investigators, who spent years on this case, said publicly before his death that he believed the group had inside connections, that someone, somewhere, knew who they were, that the reason the case was never solved was not simply because the killers were good at hiding. I do not know if he was right. Nobody does. And that is exactly the problem. Now, the date I mentioned at the beginning of this video, November 2015. The last Brabant killer attack occurred in November 1985. Under Belgian law as it existed at the time, the statute of limitations for murder was 30 years from the date of the crime. 30 years from November 1985 is November 2015. Belgian lawmakers were aware this deadline was approaching. In the years before 2015, there were attempts, formal legislative attempts, to extend the statute of limitations for the Brabant killings specifically, to pass a law that said, these crimes are too serious, too unresolved, too important to be allowed to expire. The legislation failed. In November 2015, 30 years after the last attack, the statute of limitations on the Brabant killings expired. What that means, legally, is this. If you identified the Brabant killers tomorrow, if you walked into a police station with their names, their addresses, their confessions recorded on video, they could not be prosecuted. Not for the murders. Not under Belgian law as it currently stands. The window closed. The law has officially decided that the question of who killed 28 people in Belgian supermarkets and restaurants between 1982 and 1985 is no longer a question the justice system is required to answer. In 2021, Belgian federal authorities announced new DNA analysis of evidence recovered from the crime scenes. Advances in forensic technology had made it possible to extract profiles from samples that were previously unusable. The announcement was met with cautious hope from families of victims who had spent decades waiting for any development at all. As of the time I am recording this video, no identification has been made public. The giant, the killer, the old man, 3 names that are not their names. 3 people who walked into a supermarket in November 1985, killed 8 people, walked out, and have not been accountable for a single day since. They may still be alive. If the youngest of them was in their 20s during the attacks, they would be in their 60s now. Living somewhere in Europe, perhaps in Belgium, perhaps in a town not far from Aalst, perhaps doing the same Saturday afternoon shopping that their victims were doing when they were killed. I genuinely do not know how to sit with that. I want to go back to something before I finish. I told you at the start that this story has a tendency to become about the killers, about the mystery, about the conspiracy threads, about the 3 figures with the descriptive names that are not their names. And I have spent a lot of this video doing exactly that. Because the evidence demands it. Because understanding what happened requires it. But I want to end somewhere different. 28 people, killed between 1982 and 1985, in the most ordinary circumstances imaginable. Supermarkets and restaurants, Saturday afternoons and Friday evenings, grocery lists and dinner plans. Françoise Bontinental, 32 years old. Jan Waterschoot, night watchman. A child whose family has never spoken publicly, and whom I will not name here out of respect for that silence. 25 others whose names are in the parliamentary record, and in the memories of the people who loved them, and in the formal casualty lists that Belgium has never been able to close. In November 2015. The law decided it no longer needed to find who killed them. I do not accept that. I do not think you should either. If Belgium's cold case unit finds a DNA match tomorrow, and I hope they do, the answer to what comes next will say something important about what justice actually means when the formal systems have already decided to move on. Some cases stay open not because the law keeps them open, but because the people who were lost deserve better than to be forgotten. Remember the 28, not the 3.